thanks to our brother Brandon there, we're live. Every time we go live, you can go right to Red Letter Christians, and it's on our homepage as well. But as people trickle in, let me just tell you a few things going on this month. And first of all, our hearts are heavy as we remember the lives lost in the plane crash. Most of you have probably heard there was a terrible accident in DC where at least 67 people were killed on an American plane, and 3 service members. And to add injury to injury, so the president and others have used it as an opportunity to voice their own racism and blame it on diversity and inclusion. And so we're just aware that we are against some real principalities and powers, but we grieve those lives lost. We'll do what we can to show our love and support. We're also remembering tomorrow there's an execution scheduled in South Carolina. And so at Red Letter Christians, we join our friends at Death Penalty Action, and we host an online and in-person protest and prayer vigil every time someone's executed in America. We always say no one should be killed without a protest. And so we'll be having prayer vigils and protests at every execution that takes place this year. There's a lot of other stuff happening with our emergency response to deportations and ICE raids. John, and we have one of those right here, a mile from our house in Juniata, the next neighborhood over. They raided a car wash, and 7 people were taken into custody. So this is not hypothetical. This is real time. And most of this is happening locally, but we're trying to resource people with the tools that they need, even to have an emergency response citywide. I'm meeting with our council folks tomorrow. We're trying to be a sanctuary city that does not cooperate and comply with these raids. So there's a whole information session happening tomorrow that we are sponsoring. There's going to be more. Alexia Salvatierra is our prayer guest with Jonathan and I on February 1st. She's going to be sharing a lot of stuff that we can be doing. So just keep an eye on our website. We got a little area that says Take Action. Go there, and we'll have as many resources as we can. And this month, we celebrated the life of our co-founder and our brother, our friend, Tony Campolo. John and I were together. Bishop, we missed you, but we know you were with us.
It was a joy to be together.
And
we'll have to let Bishop tell his story. He was reminding me what a help Tony was to him when he was in the pastorate.
That's right. That's right.
Well, maybe we'll start with that, Bishop. But I wanted to let folks know too. We're going to put the whole. I mean, that thing was a beautiful, not short, wonderful celebration with grandkids sharing and people whose lives that he touched, and Brian Stevenson and Hillary Clinton, and John and I read some scriptures, and we heard from all kinds of different friends of Tony's. So we're going to be posting that so you can watch it. But here's the other thing. We're going to have a virtual celebration for Tony on what would have been his 90th birthday, which is the 25th of February. So we'll be letting you know about all that, but we'll tell some Tony Campolo stories, play some vintage Tony clips, and that'll be at 7 o'clock on the 25th when Tony would have turned 90 years old. So go ahead and save the date on that. And let's get into it. We got Bishop William Barber the second, and we've got John and Wilson-Hartgrove. I always say it's okay if you didn't do your homework, but among other things, we're going to talk about white poverty, how exposing this about race and class can reconstruct American democracy. We'll talk about other stuff too, the third Reconstruction. But first of all, thank both of y'all y'all are core friends and the Bishop of Red Letter Christians. So it's good to do this book this month, though, and people have been really impacted by it. They've been reading it. We've got a lot of messages about it.
Well, thank you for having us. It's good to get to talk about it.
Indeed it is. And you are talking about Tony. I was in the pastor in his book that he wrote on hard. I think it was hard questions or hard things.
20 hot potatoes Christians are afraid to touch.
That's right. Yeah. And I decided to touch them. I just did. Might as well go on. And it was really helpful because it actually helped us in our congregation to know that you don't just have to hide and talk about those things outside of Bible study, but you can actually deal with them and speak to them. And so I introduced that book and early on in the pastorate at Greenleaf, and it was quite a helpful with me in terms of helping people to not be afraid to wrestle with the hot things and the hard things in Scripture. So I'll be forever indebted to him for that contribution.
Well, I know he sure loved you a lot too. Every time I went to visit him, we'd pray for you and talk about you. And I got Bishop. I'm thankful I got to take my little boy Elijah, who just turned 1, to visit Tony right before he passed away. So
Oh wow.
he he really knew that there's another generation, multiple generations after him that'll keep following Jesus and preaching justice. So he sure loved you a lot.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to know he's meant so much to so many. And that kind of book I think has always been in me, that I wanted to participate in writing something that didn't just travel the normal course.
Mm-hmm.
And when we first started in the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for repairs of the breach got in, the first thing we called for was an audit. James Forbes said, you got to audit America. We audited and asked for some scholars to give us the numbers on poverty. And it was interesting that when they came back with the numbers, they came back and they showed us, for instance, 60% of Black people were in poverty, and they put 30% of white and so forth. But they wouldn't disaggregate the percentages. And we kept asking. And one of them said, well, you don't want to do that because it's going to show that there are more white people in poverty by number than there are black people in terms of percentage of race are higher, but not in terms of raw numbers. And I said, why is that a problem? They said, well, the Black people going to be offended because it'll look like you're moving away from, the hard way poverty hits Black people. And some of the white people are going to be offended because they've been told so long that they're only 30% of the poverty. And they've not really dealt with the fact that they actually represent 66 million of the 140 million people who are poor and low wage. And to that, I said, thinking about Tony and dealing with hard issues, we better hope that we're ready in this country for an honest, truthful, hard conversation. And when we unpack those numbers, first of all, we have been told that by the government that there were only like 38 million poor people in the country. But when you look at the number of poor and low wage people, that's people who are within $500 of financial emergency, doing what's called a supplemental measurement, looking at who would be living in abject poverty if they didn't have some supplement from the government. It's over 140 million people, 43% of the country. 51% of our children. And when you look at it in terms of races, I said 60% of Black people, which is 26 million people, 28 to 30% of white people, but that's 66 million people, most of them women. And the majority of them are people who are actually engaged in working, or they either have a disability or something. It's not as though folk are just sitting around. And yet, when poverty is often talked about on the news or anywhere, the first image you see is a Black woman on welfare, something of that nature, which is not, it's not a lie, but it's not the whole truth. And the way it's often utilized, I'll say this finally, is it marginalizes poverty as though it's just a Black issue and only Black folk are interested, when in fact it is a deeply American issue that is crippling all of us. It is anti the gospel to preach good news to the poor, and it is unnecessary. It's something that we could literally abolish, but the powers that be like this old measurement that basically says you're not poor if you make $14,000 a year. And so if you make $7.25 an hour, you make about $15,000 a year, then you're not poor. You're in some kind of lower middle class. And then by seeing it's primarily black people and brown people who are lazy and who don't contribute anything, that lie then gets translated into, well, if I'm poor and I have to be white, it's because of all the resources going to black people, so forth and so on. When in fact, the majority of the people on even the programs that are designed to help alleviate some poverty are white. And we're not saying this, I'm not from a racist standpoint. We're saying it, Jonathan and I,
Yeah.
that if we don't break this spell of lying to the country that poverty is merely a black or brown problem, it disables our ability to see it as all of our issue, and we have to deal with it.
Yeah, and one of the things that you uh, pull out in the book is that another dynamic happening is that a lot of white folks don't have the support spiritually of a movement of theologians, historic black church liberation, like movements of freedom and justice that back them up, and they can feel really isolated and lonely, and they don't have 400 years of racist uh, policies that have kind of put them where they are. And so there's a certain kind of different isolation and loneliness they have, John. And you kind of help bring that out too, telling some of your family stories in the back. And
Well, it's
I think
what's
that's
made
what
our
I
community.
encountered as I've been traveling. I grew up in the Appalachia too. And so it's a lot of the people I knew growing up.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, you and I come from these communities. It's made them vulnerable. It's made our communities vulnerable to this Christian nationalism that we see, run amok, corporately funded and, promoted through all sorts of communications networks now. But, on the ground, it's a way of using our religion and using patriotism and people's, love for their place and their people, using all that to pit people against black folks, against immigrants, against gay folks, telling them that, those people are the problem when, as Bishop Barber was saying, the reality is that our communities have become poorer as corporations have gained more and more wealth in the balance of power, and everybody is suffering because of policies that these folks keep promoting. And we haven't been able to come together and build a movement that could really take the tools of government and change the basic structures of our lives because we've bought into so many of these lies. But the other thing that we see in our communities is that those lies that are used for political purposes end up splitting families up, splitting congregations up. And so that, every community has stories of, congregations that split, people that won't talk to each other anymore, folks that are, that are increasingly isolated because of the lies that have been told to use them politically.
Yeah, Bishop Barber, I was thinking, about this one memory I had when I was traveling with our brother Doug Paget and the Vote Common Good folks, and we met this young guy that was he was a supporter of Trump that had rethought it and decided not to be. But I'll never forget one of the things he said. He said, "I knew that we needed to flip tables. I just realized we were flipping the wrong tables." And he talked about how Trump had really kind of, exploited his anger and his distrust of systems, his disappointment with the way that the systems and structures had let him down. And so that's kind of a thread you see in some of the stories you tell through the book of folks that have real reasons to be disappointed with the government. But I mean, I think one of the questions is how do you leverage that disappointment towards change? And you kind of give us some good ideas for that. You want to say a little more about it?
Yeah, well, and it predates even Trump. Trump has inherited this strategy that has been around a long time. I'll go back as far as the Southern strategy in the late '60s, where Phillips and Pat Buchanan and Kent and others, Lee Atwater and all, decided that they were going to create what they call a positive polarization politics. They recognized that Martin King had said in '65 that the greatest threat to the racist, greedy oligarchy in this country, and their greatest fear was the possibility of black people and poor white folk coming together and forming a voting bloc that could fundamentally shift the economic architecture of the country. And the Southern Strand said, well, we have to stop that. We have to ensure that it never happens, that black and white people, particularly in the South, never see how race and class are connected, that they never see that the same forces that are keeping people down through racist policies are also the same ones blocking a real war on poverty, blocking the kind of programs for uplift that they in fact need. And so their number one goal was positive polarization. Use the split, make people angry at black folk, and in the process of then supporting people that say might vote for voter suppression, they don't realize that they're voting for somebody that also will vote against raising the minimum wage or vote against health care. And so people end up getting damaged because they are made to think that that the problem is one side. And we just saw an example of that this week when Trump freezes all of the grant money. In his mind and in the mind of folk around him, they're basically saying we're going to freeze all these preschool programs and food programs, and it's going to hurt, quote unquote, black and brown people and going to make us like heroes among white people. Well, what happens when they froze that stuff? All their white constituencies, Republicans, started calling in the offices saying, you know, you froze preschool. I need that. You froze food stamps. You know how many of us are on food stamps out here? They hadn't taught that they are right there, and so all of a sudden, not just because of what the judge did, all of a sudden he rescinds it because he didn't understand how deep this thing is among our white brothers and sisters. 70% of white people are not poor and low wealth, but 30% are. But that 30% is 40 million more than black people. And we need to build that relationship out. And so one of the things that we have to do in this season, and Jonathan and I are doing it both in terms of, he picks my brain and tapes and be used to write the book, but also by walking in hand together, brother to brother. This was a book that really needed to be done by two people, white and black, coming from different situations, but all having a connection to the scourge of poverty and knowing people and what it feels like. This is what we're saying in the book. There's a story in the book about Portia, and she was from Pearl Haven. And I tell her story often because Portia was the first or second casualty of extremists who call themselves Republicans in North Carolina refusing to accept Medicaid expansion. And when they did, it forced a number of hospital closings in North Carolina. And one of the places it forced it was down in Belle Haven, a town that's predominantly black. The county is predominantly white, but the town is predominantly black. And they had a hospital there that had been put in place with monies from the 1940s that communities could only access if they agreed that they would treat everybody regardless of color. And when they said no to the Medicaid expansion, argued that it was just going to help a bunch of quote lazy folk, which translated black and brown folk, the big hospital, the conglomerate, shut that hospital down, which meant these people now in Belle Haven have to travel over 100 miles to get to a hospital. Portia, who was a young white girl, had a heart attack 5 minutes from where that hospital was. And since it was no longer there, they told her to sit in a high school parking lot and wait on the airlifting. The airlift got there, but she was dead. She was dead. And we had a march in that city to dramatize what was going on July 4th and to help get ready to send off a white mayor who was a Republican, Trump Republican. He since kind of changed after he understood the connection. But he was going to walk to Washington, D.C., with Bob Zellner, who was the first white person to join SNCC, and to dramatize what was going on in his community because of this policy. And I went down, and her husband asked me to ride in the truck with him as a symbol of our unity and remembering his wife. And on the back bumper of that truck, it still had kind of a scraped out Confederate flag, one of those bumper stickers. And in that moment, I had to just say, that was then, this is now, and get on up on the truck and recognize that this brother, and I say that very seriously, because
Yeah.
he, had a transformative thing, and that I needed to show him that I would not hold that against him. And I needed to recognize that a lot of what people believe has been because of the ways funded lies have helped them believe it.
Mm, mm, mm.
And he, they didn't get the hospital back, but we were able to slow it down, them closing, and then we were able to get at least an emergency room back in that community. And without those folk coming together with Black folk in I said Beaufort County coming together, they would still be without even an emergency room today
Mm, mm.
in this community. And that's how serious this is.
Yeah.
And we think these stories are so important to share because we're going to need them. I
Yeah.
mean, North Carolina has seen what happens when extremists take over the government and say that it's, the basic programs that the government runs are wasteful and, that we don't need to fund them. We've seen what happens.
Mm-hmm.
People die. And
Yeah.
when people die, they don't die black or die white, they die dead. And in those moments, communities that can come together across these lines that have been used to divide us, we have the power to reclaim
Mm-hmm.
what's ours. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the government is it's a fragile creation, but it belongs to the people, and it takes a lot of work, but
Yeah.
these fusion coalitions can say, these are moral issues. It goes deeper than whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. It goes deeper than, your idea about what the best government should be. It's really about, is government serving its basic function? And when it's not, when it's actually contributing to death, it's
Mm-hmm.
everybody's responsibility to step in and do something about it.
Yeah. Bishop Barber, I was throughout the book, as you're talking about moral fusion, as we've been together so many times, I just didn't realize that the role that your father played, and that was something that he had passed on to you. So I would love for you just to say a little bit more about how you first began to see the power of moral fusion, movement building, and what that means maybe for folks that are sort of new to it, but and I always heard you say it, but then when you talked about your dad and how it passed on to you, I thought that was really powerful.
Well, and also I want to say, when Johnson says dead, we talking about 800 people a day,
Yeah.
295,000 people a year. And so it's not just that poverty actually, as it exists today, and low wages could be abolished with about 7 pieces of legislation. And poor people now represent 40% of the electorate in so-called battleground states. And just a remnant of that, 20%, really in some states, 10%, standing together, believing together, voting together, could fundamentally shift outcomes of elections and determine where we vote on things like voting rights and living wages and health care. And I'm coming to my dad in a minute, real quickly. I want to tell this one story. During COVID, the highlights days of COVID, because the minimum wage is only $7.25 an hour,
Mm-hmm.
which the legislators and Congress people say that's a low middle class, because you'll make about $15,000 a year. But tip workers make $2.13 an hour by law. Shane, do you know there were a number of tip workers during the high times of COVID that couldn't qualify for COVID release because their base pay was too low?
Mm. Mm.
And there were women, white and black, who were forced, who sick men thought they could proposition them for sex and make them prostitutes because they were waiters, barely able to feed their families. And during COVID, they had to choose to do some of the most ungodly stuff to put food on the table, and these predators understood that. I mean, we got to recognize what we're talking about when we're saying poor and low. Well, we're talking about people who may work in a factory but sleep in a car at night. You know, people who work in medical facilities and can't even afford to go there themselves. My father, early on in his work, showed me that. My father spent a lot of his time working at the Flannel House in Indianapolis, Indiana. That early on was a major entity battling poverty and wages in Indianapolis, Indiana. My father, in terms of coming together across lines, the first civil rights battle or moral fusion battle that I went through, I didn't know I had gone through it because my father waited in the hospital that I was born and would not let them put merely Negro on my birth certificate. He said, that's not all of who he is, and I'm not going to let you limit him to that. And he wrestled until they put Negro with other descent, but he would always write Negro with Caucasian and Tuscaroran descent. And he taught me that I had to own all of who I was. When I was young, my father would sponsor work camps of young Christians from all over the country who would come into a community and stay for 2 weeks, sleeping in the fellowship hall of churches and on sleeping bags and cooking outside, and then working during the day to winterproof homes and help dig wells in poor communities right down in eastern North Carolina, and then study the Word of God at night as to what all of this meant. And I was seeing that, Shane, at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years of age. You know, this real fusion coming together. You know, I'm a part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which you know is a predominantly white denomination, but we're also with a strong Black tradition. You know, there's a story in the Bible, in a book I think, about my dad coming home from the Navy, and he used to tell me this story and saying to my great grandmother one day when this guy came by the house and called her auntie, well, why? And when he left, he said, Grandma Fanny, you don't have to let him call you auntie anymore, because that was a derogatory name for Black women. They wouldn't call them by their first name. They call them auntie or the N-word or something like that. And my father took offense at it, at being in the Navy. You know, he said giving first class service for second class citizenship. And then my grandmother said, well, if I'm his aunt, shouldn't he call me aunt? And he said, what do you mean? She said, well, my brother married his sister. My brother married so-and-so, and that's her child. Now, interestingly enough, if I remember the story correct, they had gone north and passed, which some of my people did because of racism. But the point is, he had to even recognize that some of the fusion in my family didn't have anything to do with people being forced in a relationship or some slave master raping some. You know, it wasn't that. They were actual people, free Black folk who worked in relationship in the South with white brothers and sisters and Native Americans. There are real examples of that in this country.
Yeah. Oh, I was thinking of there's so many powerful stories of how that fusions work with, you know, folks in West Virginia coming together with, you know, all the different social barriers that are just being torn down and people coming together. And we've seen that over and over in DC when we've marched down there. And, you know, I can remember us saying, we are the swing vote, you know, and yet, like, I think there's a lot of people that feel like, you know, this is a big blow backwards, you know, in the last election. So I wonder if, you know, both of y'all might reflect a little bit on a lot's happened since you released the book, you know, and I think there's a lot of folks that are scared, a lot of folks that are angry right now, and how we keep the momentum even when because a lot of the stories you tell, they don't end the way that people wanted them to, but they keep moving. And I know we always say forward together, not one step back. So maybe y'all could tell us a little bit of you know, how we keep it moving even when people are feeling pretty down right now.
You want to take a shot, Jonathan, first, and I'll come back.
Sure. Well, like you, I've heard from a lot of people who are disappointed, who feel a little overwhelmed, who feel like, you know, they worked real hard and hoped for something else, but got something, you know, that doesn't just seem bad, but you know, maybe worse than the first time around. And there's a couple of things. One is that I think it's important to recognize that changes like this do make real differences, and that when you really dig down in the numbers, it's not a huge swing. Um, there were less people who voted in
Right.
this 2024 election than in 2020. So Donald Trump actually got less votes than he had gotten um, when he lost in 2020. But he did get more than Kamala Harris, and so you have to, you know, wrestle with what went on there. And we think that, you know, maybe the most significant number from the whole um, uh, election is that between all the people that voted for one side and all the people that voted for the other, the greater number was all the people who didn't vote, right? There were more people, eligible voters, who didn't show up for either one than who showed up for one or the other. And that you know that I think is a sign of a sort of deeper discontent than you know than what has been written about or touted as the you know the people who supported Trump because you know they wanted to see change or they wanted to you know they don't like how the direction the country is going. So so that makes me think about a story we tell in the book from some earlier organizing we did at the state level in Kentucky, and how when these fusion coalitions come together and people who are directly impacted by issues talk to their neighbors, that can create a different kind of narrative. And it has a real power to compel people to show up in an election and after an election, uh, you know, in ways that they haven't before. But what happened in that story that I think was significant was that the person who was running to challenge the governor at that time, who was a Trump-supported MAGA Republican in Kentucky, he was a candidate who embraced the language that movement was using. And when a candidate embraces language and says, you know, there are people who are coming together, they're asking for this, and I'm willing to represent that. That has a real catalytic power because, as we know, I mean, campaigns get the loudest microphone in the midst of election seasons, and so what you know what the principle of a campaign says is what people end up hearing on the
Mhm.
news and you know and what they read and other things. Uh, so so I think that's another significant thing when we look back at this last election that there wasn't anyone out there saying uh, you know, I'm running to represent the poor and low income people of this country. We heard a lot
Yeah.
about the middle class from Democrats. We heard a lot of, I think, false appeal to poor and low income people by Trump and others. But I don't, you know, while a few, you know, percentage wise, some people are persuaded by that. You know, it's still the case that you know most folks don't buy that. They just don't think anybody's there to represent them, so they don't show up.
That's right. And let's look at this in terms of what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that you go back and look at the debates. Not one of the debates said to either candidate, what's going to be your policies toward 87 million Americans that represent 30 plus percent of the electorate who are poor and or low wage, making $50,000 a year and below in a family of four that qualifies. And in the last election, same thing. So you've had 12 to 15 debates, and it's never come up in a major way. Um, if anything else was happening, and an announcement was made tonight that 800 people were dying a day from it, don't you know that that would be a headline, a major story? But for some reason, it's happening to the poor and low wealth, and it's not a major story. And when we look at the states that so-called battleground states, there's not one of those states where Trump so-called won, whatnot, that if something near, and some of them are as low as 1% of people. I was looking the other night in Pennsylvania. I think the margin of victory was like 60,000 votes. And there's something like over 1.3 poor and low wage voters that didn't vote.
Yeah.
So part of what we have to do is recognize nobody would be fighting this hard against using coalitions if they did not have a power within them. Trump wins the popular vote by about 2 million votes. If you got 10% of the poor, low wage, infrequent voters in those 9 battleground states that didn't vote to vote, it would overcome pretty much any margin of victory at large, any. So the answer to the political problem is already here if we'll embrace it. And what we're saying to poor and low wage folk is you either stay apart and allow the oligarchs and the aristocracy to play you against each other and win, or you come together and recognize you don't have to mobilize a whole state, but if you can get 12 to 10% of people who have not voted, who are poor and low wage, to understand that you're voting for this agenda, not even for the person. You're demanding. My vote is not a support as much as it is the demand. But the other side of that, our politics has to shift, and we got to get this message. $15 billion was spent that we know of on this season of election. $5 billion for Democrats. With that kind of money, how much money was put into actually reaching out directly to poor and low folk, and not just saying middle class. I mean, Democrats have to wrestle with that. Wrestle with that. We reached out in the Poor People's Campaign to 12 million, 15 million poor and low wage voters with some information through texting and social media that had a high response. But we had limited funds. We couldn't, but the campaign didn't have limited funds. And yet, in some of the advertising and whatnot, it still did not reach down and have a direct message for, if you elect us in the first 50 days, we're going to pass a living wage, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, that are directly facing the lives of poor and low wage people. I pretend that we've got to, and I don't know exactly how, I mean, we're trying to do it and we're going to keep trying and figuring it out. But I remember that night when the young man was on the football field a couple of years ago and he died. They thought he had died. And everybody got to see it. And it opened up the floodgates of the hearts of America. His nonprofit went from a little bit of money to millions because people actually saw the death. The players saw it. They saw him almost die, and they changed. People that didn't even know him said, I'm going to support him. White people that didn't even know him said, I'm going to support him. Somehow or another, we've got to show America these deaths and let them stop thinking, oh, well, if 800 people are dying, it's just some poor white trash or some black person or some Latino person. No, it's your neighbor.
Yeah, your neighbor.
It's your neighbor. It's God's people. It's God's creation. And it may be even coming to your door.
Yeah. So I
accept it. You don't have to take it anymore. You really do have power.
As you were saying all that, I was thinking of those numbers, and folks saying that we can't end poverty until we end extreme wealth. And Gandhi, I've always liked that quote from Gandhi, Jonathan, that there's enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. And it's almost impossible even to calculate right now exactly how big the wealth disparity is. I was just looking it up. Bezos is making about $900 a second, roughly, right. $59,000 every single minute. Musk is like it's almost $40,000 every minute. 3 people owning the same amount as like 50 countries combined. So we talk a lot about a living wage, but I was thinking of Jonathan, that when Dr. Perkins says we've got the best politicians that money can buy, and it is about buying your politicians. So it feels like, I mean, we're up against that. So I love what you're saying, Bishop Barber. But the numbers feel like so like we're going to have to deal outside of the economics, but we got to do something about extreme wealth too, right?
Well, I think we have to, and I think there's someone that make this about, what they call what they call it, of wealth. But here's something that we also got to put before the people. It costs more to keep as many people in poverty than it does to implement the truth, the fair things that would not only lift people out of poverty, but put more in the gross domestic product. The strange thing is working to move people out of poverty actually benefits the country.
Yeah.
I mean, if you took uh, uh, um, if just the living wage would pump something like $30 billion, 300 billion dollars into the economy that currently we don't have. Uh, um, Healthcare would keep people from being sick, and that would allow them to be at work more. If we had taken during COVID, we took poor and low wage workers, a lot of them, they worked to save the rest of us, but we call them essential, but treated them like they were expendable.
Yeah.
So yes, extreme wealth is problematic. That we have to ensure the wealthy pay their fair share, but more importantly, we've got to deal with this fact, and this is why it's going to take this major rising up among poor people, particularly in the political booth. Is we can't outspend Elon Musk or somebody, but we can't outvote them.
Come on.
And if we by voting them, we can either run candidates or put candidates in who will understand that it was a coalition of black and brown and so forth, poor and low wage people that got them in office. And then we need to be constantly in their face around these issues. And then lastly, we have to make sure that we get, if we can't get the money, the level of money and the way in which money can come into politics and basically buy it off, simply so they could get tax cuts. But that's why I'm so glad. I hate that it happened, but I'm glad people got to see it, and I hope it sticks, of the level at which Trump extremism is willing to go to pay for some more tax cuts. I mean,
Yes.
look at the list of things they were willing to get rid of just this week. Even food lunch, school lunches.
I know.
The very things that only make up about 1% or so of the total budget. But people, I think, more than addressing how much money other people have, is looking at what we have in our hand, Moses.
That's a good word.
We have in our hand, David. We have enough power just in our together. Remember, Dr. King said, as I said, the greatest fear of the greedy aristocracy is not that suddenly we get all the same amount of money they have, is that we've realized our power together to, in fact, control elections and then put people in office that will shift policy. That power is almost like it's available to us right now.
Yes.
And sometimes my prayer is the one that Elisha and them prayed over the servant. Lord, help them to see what I see.
Right. It sure ought to be the equalizer. No matter how many billions of dollars, you only got one vote, one
Right.
hope. That's what we're going to work for. Jonathan, so I got like 2 questions left. And then, by the way, everybody, if you're tuning in, write your questions in the chats. My buddy Brandon's watching, even on, the YouTube and the Facebook and all that. If you got a question or thought or just want to say hi, throw it in there. Some of y'all are here on Zoom. You got the direct link, so we're watching the chat there. Couple of things that I wanted to ask you left, and then we'll see if other folks have questions. Jonathan, I thought this when you talk about the $400 emergency test, right? This was a really important thing to think about. Poverty is certainly people living in their cars. So right outside my window, there's folks living on the sidewalk. So that's the obvious stuff. But there's also folks that are just one emergency away from not having a home or not being able to pay the bills. And as you all do the math, it came up to be like 43% of the country that meets that definition of poverty. If they had an emergency that cost $400, they wouldn't be able to make it, make ends meet. So you want to say a little bit more about that? Because I think that helps broaden our compassion for, I mean, certainly we care about the guy on the sidewalk, but we're also fighting for the people not to end up on the sidewalk.
Yeah. Yeah. One important thing that we tried to do with this book is redefine poverty, right?
Yeah.
Along the lines of what you're saying, because the official poverty measure that Bishop mentioned earlier, that's what the federal government uses. I mean, it really is, if you just think about it for a minute, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, it's a little over $15,000 this year. There's nowhere in this country where you can afford to, even rent the cheapest place and live on $15,000 a year. So we are, we're talking about homelessness here at a level that you're not technically poor. So there are many more people who are poor than the federal government recognizes, but because that's the measure that the federal government uses, it also is what all of our data is based on, right? So even anti-poverty organizations that are trying to, speak up for the poor and fight for, more funding and even like with private foundations and other things, people who are challenging us to do something for the so-called poor, they're talking about the data we have, which is based on those numbers. And so part of the reason we think that, all of these myths that have been used to divide us are so effective is because people don't recognize the size of the problem. I mean, it's just, well, as Bishop was saying, if 800 people were dying every day from anything else,
Lord.
we'd have some kind of, emergency commission to figure out what's
It
going
was
on here.
It was 500 people dying a day from COVID, and it became a pandemic.
Yeah.
For poverty is the fourth leading cause of death, John, and 300 more people a day are dying. The hard thing is there's too much dying in invisibility.
Yeah.
And you're right, Jonathan. The issue is not getting the world to see it, and then getting our brothers and sisters who are poor and low wealth to see it and to see the connections. One of the stories we tell in the book is about Laken out in Kentucky. And she came. We were there on the anniversary of a date during Red Summer, and I think it was 1920, when they had run all the black folk out of the town. When Woodrow Wilson allowed it to happen, riots all over the country to put soldiers coming back from World War I in their place, while he was lying about a pandemic, by the way, and and allowing people to die unnecessarily. So what Trump did is not new. It actually has roots as 100 years ago. And but Laken came up and said, I need to thank you for teaching me how to love my family and being a family. Because she said she was in a situation where her mother and her father, whom she loved dearly, who had helped them make it in poverty, were also her worst enemy. She said that my mom, and they were church going folk, but they were taught, this extreme gospel. And so they believed that black and brown people were the reason for their poverty. They believed that, they had to stop. And queer people and homosexuals were what's causing their problems, and not the greed and the folk who took their union rights and whatnot. And she said, I love my parents. They worked hard, but they were my worst enemies. And then she said, because I had that feeling, I thought I was an atheist. So I left the faith. But in this movement, she said, I recovered two things. I recovered my faith. I gained a family strong enough to enable me to love and challenge my own family. And in those same counties out there in Kentucky, when Bashir ran for office, we never endorsed him. We don't endorse candidates, but we talked about. But he went out, and he wasn't the incumbent. He went in those hills and started talking to people about It's not about left and right, but it's about right and wrong. If I get elected, I'm gonna raise this minimum wage. I'm gonna bring back Medicaid expansion and work for health care for all. And he won in Kentucky. He's won twice in Kentucky, and he did by telling the truth. And if we can get, all of our politicians to do that, we can see a different reality. But how we get there is for that. There comes a point, and there's two texts in the Bible that grab me, Shane, and they're not blaming texts. They're Holy Spirit animating texts. It's one when the lepers and the kings say, "Will we just sit here and die?" Will we just sit here and die? And then they say no. And they start going toward the enemy's camp. And God turns their leprous, limping, hurting bodies into a sound that makes the enemy think it's hundreds of thousands of them. And then the question in the misery of the pool, Bethesda, the pool at Bethesda, had a high misery index. And when Jesus goes there, what is interesting is he goes to the one that's been there the longest, we think, 38 years. And he does not so-call heal him, but he asks him a question: do you want to be made whole? And what we have to say without sounding condescending and without blaming the people who are hurting is to go and show people what their power is and say, do you want to be whole? Take up your vote, take up your mat, take up your power and walk.
Hallelujah.
You have a prophetic ministry in your poverty to this country. You have a prophetic ministry to stop this country from being engaged in policy murder. And so whether it's that or whether it's, I often think about how many times God says in the word, y'all do that, I'm going to kill you. And then God changes his mind or finds another way out. Like in Ezekiel, when God tells Ezekiel, the princes and the priests have connived together. And because of that, justice is at epidemic proportion, the poor being exploited, the widow, so forth. But then God says, if I can find somebody that'll stand in the gap. And the text says, God says, I couldn't. Well, God had said, if I don't find somebody to stand in the gap, I'm gonna destroy the place. But 15 chapters later, God stops looking for somebody that isn't in the gap to stand in the gap. God finds a whole valley of people in the gap. God's first request was, can I find somebody that'll go stand in the gap? God then redirects his own request and says, I know what, Ezekiel, go to the valley. Because I don't need somebody to come stand in the gap for the people. I need the people already in the gap. And I just need you to believe, if you go in the gap, that they may have broken bodies, they may have been treated so bad that they weren't even seen as worthy to be buried. But I need you to believe that those dusty, broken bones still have soul ears. And if you preach to their soul ears, they'll get up. And if you can go down there and organize and then get out the way, I'll put the spirit in them and they will become the army. You won't just have one in the gap, you'll have a whole army in the gap. And that's what we've got to see today. That's what John and I and all of us are working on.
Yeah.
Not doing it for people, but helping them to understand the power they have.
Woo!
And that God who just won't give up on us, who's gonna
Won't give up.
keep seeing the spirit win.
That feels good. I think we're winding up. I was hoping we get a little word, Bishop. You don't get on a book club call with Bishop William Barber and not get a little of the word. The last thing I was going to say, you got us into it, was this section of the book that says there's, the Pew study showed like 50,000 sermons that didn't even mention poverty and the poor, and it's all there. thousands of verses on poverty and justice, and you've called, so many of us to have moral courage. And this feels like a moment where we need that moral conscience, right? We need preachers to preach. We need to look at those verses like the ones you just gave us, and see what the Holy Spirit's going to do right now. So, Jonathan, I don't know if you want to say more about why this is a social crisis, but it's also a spiritual crisis, because we have a church that's been silent as 800 children of God die every day of poverty.
Yeah, we have a lot of lies, even lies that get wrapped in our spiritual language and even in, selected quotes from the scriptures. We've been talking about policy that's all based on, a basic lie, which is that what we collectively dedicate to trying to address poverty and its systemic injustice is somehow waste, and that it's being, stolen from the so-called makers and given to the takers. That's not what the Bible tells us about how God sees those who are poor. And there's a whole lot of Christianity that's gone along with the lies. But what Bishop was just telling us is right at the heart of not just Ezekiel, but Jesus and all the rest of the scriptures, which is that God is especially present among the poor. Jesus said, I will show up to you when you feed those who are hungry, when you welcome the stranger, when you take care of the sick and those who are in need. And we are forfeiting our spiritual inheritance and rejecting Jesus when we believe these lies. So, yeah, there is a spiritual message, which is this invitation to trust that what Jesus said is true, and that, all the ways that it resonates with what, the prophets say, and many others, even from other religious traditions, have said about where we find our true selves, and as a society, who can bring us hope. And in those valleys where we've met poor and hurting people, we've also seen that those people do have the power to come together and to save us. And I'll just say quickly, I tell this story often because I think it's a reminder that exactly the opposite of the lies is what is really true. One of the lies with all this like anti-DEI and anti-wokeness talk that's happening these days is they attacked that 1619 project. They said, oh, that's trying to take away, our American history and blame white people. And I happen to live not too far from Jamestown, and where the ship showed up in 1619. So back at the 400th anniversary, 2019, three generations of my family drove over there together, and we sat under this freedom tree, which is where when the first enslaved folks up there got away from the plantations and the families got there under the freedom tree. The men said, we'll go fight for the Union Army if you'll teach our students here. You teach our kids to read and so that they'll have a place in the society. And that freedom tree is the beginning of the fight for universal public education. So three generations of my white family that was just, for a long time in the South, dirt farmers, we sat there and talked about how these black folks who got the right to vote partnered with our ancestors and made public education possible for people like us. They're always going to try to tell you if somebody else gets something that's going to take away from you, but it's not true.
The devil's a liar.
The only reason my people ever got educated was because some black folks joined with them to vote for public education. In so many ways, that's the story, right? That when we come together, the people who are at the very bottom and do what we can, God joins with us and makes something possible that benefits everyone.
Come on. I was this is so powerful, y'all. If you haven't read it, check it out. White Poverty. This is the newest book Reverend Barber and Jonathan did together. And Jonathan tells a lot of his story at the end. Always such a gift to be together, y'all. And Reverend Barber, we're going to let you take us out in a minute. I was thinking of Bishop Buddy, though. We've all been trying to support her and her courageous act of speaking. I mean, it was the word, right? I've been telling people, Bishop, if you are offended by the 2-minute homily of Bishop Buddy, wait till you read the Sermon on the Mount. It's going to mess you up.
Well,
So we're going to continue to stand with those that are preaching the word and showing moral courage. But you send us out, brother. Any last word? You get the last word. And then if you want to give us a little benediction, Bishop, we'll go.
well, I'm gonna do a little. My granddaddy's preaching, who was a old holiness preacher, and it's got a little judgment in it, but it's necessary. When you look at Bishop Buddy's word, people forget the other side of that, where Jesus said, "You have mercy, that the mercy you get will be measured out by the mercy you give." Yeah, I don't realize. I hope the country realize how that the way she did that, the danger it put folk in who refuse to show mercy. She basically was saying, "You are under the judgment of God if you don't hear me." Because that's the book. That's what the book says. Like you said, if you're offended by that, you ought to read the rest of what Jesus says about mercy, particularly if you're not merciful. And we're called to that. But in addition to that, I think there's some ways we can support her and support her. And I've been wrestling with this. I've been dealing with it today. And I don't know, Shane, if we get together and do it or when, but I just had this vision today thinking about this piece. What if, in 1968, Dr. King said they were going to come and stay, but they couldn't because you can't keep poor folk in D.C. but so long, just the sheer way of having to do that. People got to go back. But I've been thinking today, what if there was a way we could build 800 caskets and put them out on the and get a permit to put them out on the mall everywhere, and on top of each one of them, write the kind of death that somebody would have died simply from poverty. And then what if we could also have a wall of something of unity that shows the things that happen in this country when Black and white people, particularly when it came together. And we preach in the midst of that for a week or two. Somebody a stage and all preaching every day. I don't know why. I just feel like, this is my word to the church, the word to you, that somewhere we're going to have to figure out a way to scare people to life, not scare them to death. And right now I'm thinking about the only thing that changed that centurion was when he saw Jesus on the cross and the way he died. He said, "Surely this must be the Son of God." Might it be that the only way America is going to see poor and low-wage people as children of God is to figure a way to put their death right in their eyesight and force them to see something that Dr. King did at the funeral of the 4 girls who died 17 days after I was born. 17 days. 15 days. In that eulogy, Dr. King said, the issue is not who killed them, but what. And I want to encourage folk to read it tonight, because he says that those girls still have something to say to us. And he went down a list. He said, and interestingly, in that final piece, he put a little bit of blame on everybody to call us. And my daddy told me that there were people who were on the fence about civil rights until that bombing happened, and they could no longer stay on the fence. King said she died, but every racist sheriff in the South that so and so and so. They died because of every Dixiecrat that so and so and so. They died because of every Northern Republican that so and so and so. They died because of every person committed to being what did he call it? A middle person. So they died because of every preacher that refuses to preach the truth in their pulpit. And then he says they even died because of every African American, every Negro that refuses to challenge the system of racism. Read it sometime, Shane.
Mm,
He
mm,
lays in there everybody. And I got mad the first time I read it because I said, how dare you, Dr. King,
mm,
say that the black person that wouldn't stand up to racism was an accessory to the death of these 4 little girls, just like a racist. And it's not they were just like, but what he wanted folk to hear was that you don't get a pass.
mm, mm.
That if you don't stand, and then Coretta Scott King came back at the first meeting of the Poor People's Campaign. They called it Solidarity Day, June 1968, and she said violence is a child not having education, a person not having living wage job. I'm paraphrasing. She said not providing housing, so forth and so on. And then she said, but violence is also an apathetic attitude toward these other forms of violence. God help the church be delivered from the demon of apathy and quietness in the face of so much unnecessary
Mm,
from us.
mm.
Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, Bishop. Thank you, Jonathan. I love y'all. It's always good to be together. Bishop, you want to close us in prayer?
That was my prayer.
That's it. We'll go in peace, y'all. And love you both. Yeah. And stay in touch with us, y'all. Join us next month. This is our book next month, Healing Resistance. You read this, Jonathan? Kazu Haga's book. It's very
I
much
have not
rooted
yet.
in the
No, I have to check it
Indian
out.
tradition. We'll be reading this next month. And Jonathan, I'll see you on Saturday. We're going to have Alexia Salvatierra for morning prayer. So we'll see y'all at 9 o'clock Eastern time. What a gift tonight was. Thank you, Bishop. Thanks, Jonathan.
Bless you,
Bye,
sir.
y'all.
Bless y'all. Take care.
Love y'all. Bye.